Hey pals, I'm here today to talk about some autumn reading recommendations. So it doesn't yet feel like autumn where I live in East Anglia in England because it's still between like 21 and 25 degrees most days, still pretty sunny, everywhere is still very green. So I thought I would film in front of my living room couch, which does always look like autumn because we have black walls and an orange sofa, which is by design because I absolutely love autumn, wish I could live in it all year round. We spend the whole summer with our blinds closed in the lounge so that we can just keep the sun out and just kind of like live every day like it's much cooler and darker than it actually is outside. So I have about 15 books here to talk about. They kind of fulfill certain themes that I love reading all year round, but in particular like reading in the autumn. I'm not talking about a single book here that I didn't really enjoy and wouldn't recommend. Some of these are favourites. I have done videos like this previously, and so I've made sure not to repeat any recommendations, which can always be quite tricky. Only recommending books I think are really brilliant and never repeating a recommendation. So yeah, hopefully I've selected a good group of books here that you'll want to add to your autumn TBR. But I will link above a video of this nature that I did a couple of years ago that I checked the other day to see which books I spoke about in it, and like I love all those books and would love to reread them this autumn. So I'll link that above. So firstly, I'm going to touch on a couple of kind of like historical fiction books. I really love reading historical fiction this time of year. I know there's a lot of kind of gothic historical fiction that comes out, particularly set in like Edwardian or Victorian England. And then also I in particular like reading like early 20th century literature, whether it was written at the time or has been written since. It's really bizarre to say that during a time of fear and scarcity around the two world wars, these books have this sense of community and care and kind of comfort in getting by with very little. And so I really enjoy those type of books, and one always really stands out to me, and that is Dorene by Barbara Noble. This is a fairly short book published by Persephone. I mean, they're just great for this time of year. You know, they publish a lot of books set in around the time period I just mentioned, many more I want to get to. But this in particular is about a young girl called Dorene who is evacuated out of London and sent to live in the countryside. And it is just the story of her time there in the countryside with this family she's sent to live with, what it's like for a young girl who's grown up in a really urban area to suddenly be in this really rural location, to see things happen around her that she's never experienced before, and to start to settle and to really enjoy this new life, but also know that ultimately she wants to get back to her family in London. I really enjoyed this. This was just such a lovely comfort read, and I think this really captured the voice of a child really well. I think Dorene's around 10 years old in this, and there is a bit of sort of tension and drama towards the end, which I don't want to spoil, but yeah, there is a kind of heart in your throat moment towards the end, which kind of added to this being a really good autumnal read. So that is Dorene by Barbara Noble. The next one is by one of my favourite authors. I think she's one of the best writers who has ever lived, and that is Affinity by Sarah Waters. Now, I've read all Sarah Waters' books, but crazily, I've only read this and Tipping the Velvet once. All the others I've read multiple times. So I would really like to reread this during this autumn season because this is one of her spookier books. It's also her shortest book, so it's around 300 pages, so it's definitely one you can try and fit into your autumn reading. So this is set in the Victorian times, and this is interested in that kind of era within the Victorian period where spiritualism was really on the rise and people started to claim themselves as mediums, and a lot of people started to go to these sort of evening events where they would, through a medium, contact the deceased. And the premise of this book is we're following two women from vastly different social backgrounds. One is a middle-class woman who is just trying to keep herself busy until she meets an eligible bachelor and is wed, and so she's volunteering at a local women's prison. She becomes really friendly with one of the inmates, and we know that that inmate is there because of a violent event that took place at a spiritual reading. She worked for a medium. We don't know precisely what happened. Part of this book is finding out exactly how that went down, and this book in that sense reminds me quite a lot of Fingersmith by this author, in that it's really intricately plotted, and when you realise exactly what happened, you'll want to kind of flick back and reread sections to be like, oh my God, like I didn't see that at all. I didn't piece that together. It's really brilliantly crafted. And yeah, it's kind of spooky and eerie and unsettling. A lot of the scenes take place within the prison. And yeah, you're never quite sure what to believe, whether there are spirits involved in this or whether it's just like the dark nature of living people. There's a quote on the back of this which I remember reading and getting goosebumps. And it's, "Now you know why you were drawn to me, why your flesh comes creeping to mine, and what it comes for. Let it creep." Oh, so eerie. Yeah, I highly recommend this one. I'll definitely be rereading it myself this autumn season. Now, you may well know that I absolutely love rural novels or novels that take place in an isolated setting, in particular remote parts of like Scotland or on islands. So I have a few books that touch on that, and this first one kind of blends historical fiction and that rural setting. I'm going to link a video above, which is actually one of my most popular videos I've ever filmed, which I was not expecting at the time I filmed it, and that is recommending books set in rural Britain. And actually I had a look back at that video the other day, and it contains like some of my all-time favourite books in it, and one of which is this next book. So yeah, if you are interested in those type of books, do go and check that video out, because I just love a lot of the books, well, all of the books in that video. One of which was All Among the Barley by Melissa Harrison. So this takes place in rural Suffolk, which is where I'm from, and it takes place in the autumn of 1933. And we follow from the perspective of a young girl coming of age. She is the child of farmers, and there's lots of change happening in her local community. This woman comes from London who's really attractive and sophisticated, and our protagonist feels kind of compelled by her. Also, these kind of violent events start to take place within the community, and there's just a real sense of unease, uncertainty, and kind of creeping malevolence throughout the narrative. I really love this book. I found it really unsettling. The way Melissa Harrison writes about the natural world is just spectacular. And as I said, this book opens in the autumn, and a lot of the book is about how farmers would prepare at this time of year to survive the colder months when they, aren't able to grow any crops. And I think that was all really well handled. And there is an afterword in this book which I found absolutely, heartbreaking. I found the book really heartbreaking, but once I realised where this book was going and read that afterward, I just, felt kind of broken by it. So yeah, I'd highly recommend this one. Really beautiful rural coming of age novel, but also set in the autumn with a lovely autumnal cover. Then, to be completely honest, I would probably recommend every single book by this author to be read in the autumn, because I think just all of her books have that sense of either kind of history or mystery, or they're set in quite domestic settings. And I think a lot of the time we spend more time indoors in the autumn, and so reading books that take place in these more domestic settings really works. In particular, I think Night Waking by Sarah Moss is a brilliant autumnal read, another one I'll definitely be rereading. I can't believe that Sarah Moss is one of my favourite authors, and I don't think I've reread any of her books, which is just absolutely unforgivable. So I will definitely be rereading this. I read this years ago, and I think about it so often. Like, I don't think a week has gone by where I haven't thought about this book since I read it. It's just a wonder. This book is about a family who moved to a remote Hebridean island because the husband is an ecologist and he's studying the puffins there. His wife is doing research on her PhD, which is to do with mothering through the ages. And in part, this is a novel about that battle of women being expected to take on all of the duties of the household, including all the child rearing, as well as do her own actual job, writing this PhD, and the husband just gets to go off and do whatever he wants. There's some really difficult to read scenes in this book about the children not sleeping through the night, and how our protagonist starts to feel like she's losing her mind, that she can't actually trust herself with her children. But a narrative thread that runs through this book is that very early on, a body, a very old skeleton, is found in the garden, and our narrator becomes interested in who that body could be, and she's in particular interested because her husband's ancestors took the land of people who would have lived there in sort of crofts many years ago. So she feels like the death of this person could be due to her husband's ancestors, and so she's really interested in that, and that the story of that body also becomes part of the narrative. So yeah, this book is set on this really windswept island. It's very moody and atmospheric, but it also has this kind of undercurrent of unease, both to do with this mother feeling like she's losing her mind because she never sleeps, and also to do with this body that's been found in the garden. I just absolutely love this one, and one of my favourite books of all time. And the next one is another one I'll definitely be rereading myself this autumn, and that is The Valley at the Centre of the World by Malaki Talic. I loved this book. I desperately need to reread this. It's one of those books that's very low plot, very slice of life, very interested in the domestic details of these people's lives. The premise of this is it's set on the Isle of Shetland, which is a Scottish island, and it's set in a more rural part of that island, and we follow a group of characters who live in this valley. Their houses are a fair distance from one another, but they're walkable, and there's a map at the start which shows you where all their houses are in location to one another. Most of them are crofters, so they work and live on the land. And as I said, we follow this group of people. One is a man who's more of a newcomer to the area, but has really quickly settled in with his wife, but his wife has just left him. And so he really loves where he lives. He doesn't want to lose this life. He's fearful that he will. And it's about him trying to find his roots, figure out what he's going to do now. And he has a really good connection with his in-laws who live very close by. There's also an older man who has lived in this area for, his family have lived there for generations, and he's really fearful about all the changes, about the fact that everybody seems to be leaving these more remote parts of the island to go to the main town. And there's also a woman who is a newcomer who's just moved in and is trying to kind of settle. And you just follow this community of people, their day-to-day lives, their interactions with one another, and I just think it's a really beautiful study of a really fascinating community, and I just loved it. And out of all the books I've read since, the one that gave me the feel of that the most was The Road to Dalton by Shannon, which I read earlier this year. The Road to Dalton is set in 1990 in a small town called Dalton in Maine, and in this you also follow a group of characters, I think around 5 or 6, who all get their own kind of viewpoint chapters in this small kind of remote town in Maine. And it's slice of life. It's about the interactions these people have with one another, how they're all kind of connected through either romance or familial relationships or friendships, or like one of the people in the book is one of the police officers, so he has interactions with people through his work. And again, it's this study of a small community, of what life is like when everybody knows everything about everybody, how that includes kind of comfort and security, but also intense scrutiny and judgment. And this book is filled with every emotion. It's heartbreaking, yet comforting. It's raw, yet warm. I just, really enjoyed it. I think if you've read either of these books, you'd really enjoy the other. Even though they have such different settings, I think they evoke the same kind of feeling. Then I have 2 more rural novels. Both of these are set seasonally, so the books are split into 4 sections. Each section is one of the seasons. I know that isn't completely autumnal, but I think that books like this, that have this kind of rural setting and are set seasonally, really feel comforting. They're the sort of book I want to read curled up on the sofa in a dark evening with a cup of tea and a candle. And they're really focused on living off the land and domesticity, which always makes me think of the autumn time. The first one is The House of Broken Bricks by Fiona Williams. This is told from the perspectives of 4 family members, a mother, father, and their 11-year-old twin sons. And the book opens after a major heartbreaking event has happened to the family. We don't know what that event is, but we follow them as they all deal or don't deal really with the emotional repercussions of that event, and how they don't communicate with one another about how they feel. And they all kind of try and bumble through. They live in a small village. They run a fruit and veg company, and so their life is very much tied to the seasons, to the land. And a big part of this narrative is that the mother is black, she's from London. She loves this life they have where they live off the land and have all this sort of fresh produce around them. But she knows that she's not welcomed there. There's lots of kind of everyday microaggressions from people who even claim to be her friends. And so I really enjoyed that finally I could read a rural book set in England that actually dealt with these types of topics, because in large part these type of rural novels do centre completely on white characters, and that just isn't the case. People of colour live in the countryside. So yeah, I love this. I thought it was absolutely beautifully written. Lots of scenes at the dinner table, in the kitchen, which I love. And yeah, just really heartbreaking, beautiful nature writing. So I'd highly recommend this one. Just a lovely one to curl up with in the autumn. The next one, I am tempted to reread. I only read this one a couple of years ago when it came out, but I already want to reread it. I think as soon as I finished it, I wanted to reread it. And that is Amy and Lan by Sadie Jones. As I said, this is also set seasonally. Interestingly, this is set in a kind of commune where 3 families have banded together. They've bought this old farm and the area of land around the farm, and they live communally. A couple of them have jobs that take them off the farm and they bring in the only income, but the rest of them work on the farm. And the book opens when the family have decided to make a further income off the land by starting like an Airbnb in one of the outbuildings. The book is narrated by Amy and Lan. I think when the book opens, they're around 8, and I think we move through to them being around 12. This book is like weird because what I'm about to say is going to sound like it doesn't fit with what I've just described. But I read this with my heart in my throat because even though it's very slow and slice of life, there's an awful lot of tension in this book for 2 reasons. One, there's loads of stuff going on with the adults. I think a lot of us want to believe that the idea of living communally, it would be wonderful, but I think time and time again we've seen these stories where actually we realise the many pitfalls of living communally, and that's something that you really see, that the children aren't really witnessing. The children love living communally because they can just be with their friends all day, but there's stuff that they describe to you that they don't understand, or there's tensions building between the adults. Also, the adults have a really hands-off approach with the child rearing. So there's many points in the narrative where you think Amy and Lan are going to die. Like you're absolutely sure there's going to be an awful accident and they're not going to survive it. So yeah, there's lots of tension, and this book is about that, building tension. The seasonal writing in this is again absolutely beautiful. There's a Christmas scene in this which I absolutely loved, and I should probably just reread that Christmas chapter every year because it was wonderful. But yeah, definitely one I think to read on the colder, darker nights. Like my memory of this book is more about the moments they spent when it was cold and they're trying to like warm up by the fire. So definitely an autumnal read. Then I thought I'd talk about a few books that are set within schools or colleges. I love reading books set in schools, colleges, be they boarding schools or just day schools. And I think this is the perfect time of year to read them because it's like back to school season. And even if you yourself are not going back to school, you can kind of feel like you are through the books you're reading. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Pet by Katherine Chidi. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. This book is set in New Zealand, I think in the 1980s. And we follow a young girl who's around 10, 11 years of age. She's going to a Catholic school. And the book opens with her as an adult woman visiting her father in a nursing home when one of his carers reminds her of a teacher she had. And you're aware in this present day section that she's not really happy about bumping into this woman. And so then we go back and she narrates the story of why she is kind of unnerved by this teacher. So she had this teacher who was very young and attractive and glamorous, and all of the children wanted to be her pet. And so she would get the children to do jobs that she 100% shouldn't have got the children to do, but it was kind of allowed because of the time. Within this book, our protagonist is dealing with the grief of her mother dying and being raised by her single father, who's trying to also deal with this grief, as she starts to try and get closer to this teacher than even the other students are because of the loss of her mother. And things start to happen within the classroom that are unsettling. Little things start to go missing, and this teacher starts to target certain children 100% for prejudice reasons. She'll target children who are like, there's one child who's the only child of colour in the school. She'll target another child because they come from a poor family, and she'll think that those are the children who are doing the stealing. And so yeah, this book starts to be about this kind of obsession with this teacher, the things being stolen, and all of that. That's all I'll say. This book is very unnerving. This would be a brilliant adaptation if this was made into a film, because there's some real, like there was sections where I almost felt like screaming at the protagonist because like I could see what was going to happen and I really didn't want it to, and I was on the edge of my seat. And this book went somewhere I completely didn't expect. Really admired the author for going there. So yeah, it really has those back to school feels. A lot of it is set within the classroom. There's a lot of really kind of scary, tense scenes in the classroom and on school trips. And yeah, it just has that kind of undercurrent of menace. I think menace is the perfect word actually, that makes this feel like a kind of spooky autumnal read to me. Another book set in an educational setting is The Damages by Genevie Scott. I read this earlier this year and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was fantastic. This is actually set during a snowstorm across a few days. So this could be like an autumn or winter read, but I put it in the autumn because it has those back to school feels. It opens when our protagonist is then starting college and kind of builds up to this blizzard a few months into the college year. And also it has that kind of undercurrent of tension and unease throughout it, which I think make it a really perfect read for this time of year. This again is a split narrative. It's set in 2020 and 1998. In 2020, our protagonist's husband is accused of an assault, and this accusation makes Roz start thinking of an event that happened when she was at college in Ontario in 1998. And so a lot of the book is her recapping her time at college, and a lot of the book is kind of her trying to work through her guilt, whether her guilt is appropriate, whether she should be blamed, whether she could have done more, and trying to kind of figure out precisely what did happen. Because during this blizzard in 1998, her roommate disappeared and stuff happened, and Roz was not very willing to assist the police at that time. That's as much as I'll say. There's loads of really complicated discussions taking place in this book that I greatly admired. Thought they were really well handled. And there's just some real scenes, excellent scenes set in the college, and where you see these young people try and kind of battle their way up the social hierarchy, and like the things they're willing to do to themselves and to others to stay at the top, I thought were really interesting and yeah, really tense to read. Then one that isn't really spooky at all, but I really enjoyed this book, and it is a college setting, and so I wanted to recommend it. I just think it's a book that more people should be reading and enjoying, and that is Come and Get It by Kylie Reid. This is set on a college campus, and it follows a group of characters who are all linked to one dorm. So the main character we follow is the RA, who looks after the students on that floor, but we also follow a few young women who live in one of the dorms on that floor, and all the kind of messy relationships they have going on. And then there's also a visiting academic who starts to interview some of the girls on that floor, initially about their thoughts about weddings, but she becomes much more interested in their thoughts about finances. That sounds really boring. It really isn't. This book is incredibly interested in like the small details of all these characters' lives. Again, it has this really slowly building tension where you can just see that all these characters are making slightly the wrong decisions, but they make enough of slightly the wrong decisions that it starts to, you know, build up. And I just loved, this felt so imbued with this college setting. I could picture it all. I was fascinated by all the details. You could tell that Kylie Reid had done like so much research. This world was like fully realised. I loved where this book went. I think all of its examination of wealth and race and class and gender were really interestingly dissected. And yeah, just the perfect read for this kind of like back to school time. And I have a couple of kind of darker reads with more like violent events in them that I thought would be appropriate for this kind of spookier, darker time of year. One of them is Little Rot by Quzi, which is a really recent release. This is set over one weekend in New Lagos. We follow a group of, I think, five perspectives, 5 viewpoint characters as shit goes down. I don't really want to spoil much about this book. What I'll say is that a lot of trigger warnings here. A lot of this novel takes place at sex parties. These sex parties are pretty wild, so there is some really difficult scenes to do with sex, sexual violence and sex with minors. There are lots of descriptions of sex in the book, in particular kind of sex that feels somewhat violent, be that through choice or not. And yeah, it goes some pretty dark places. This book is just a wild, kind of chaotic ride, which I really loved. I think it really delves into the kind of deep recesses. I think it really delves into like the deep recesses of the mind and what each of us might be capable of if pushed, or if surrounded by other people who are kind of giving in to their most craven desires, would we also? I think those questions are dealt with really well in this book. and I just, yeah, had such a good time reading this and would highly recommend it as one of a darker, more violent read. And then I know lots of people talk about the secret history by Donna Tartt in videos of this nature, and of course I would agree with that. I've read a lot of books over the years that have said that I like that book, and with every book except this one I've disagreed. The one book I've read that I think is like The Secret History, more in writing style than anything else, is White Ivy by Susie Yang. I think Susie Yang entirely captures the type of writing style Donna Tartt has, where it just feels really decadent and luxurious and kind of just meanders through all this decadence. It's not trying to rush anywhere and just feels really rich. I really loved her writing style in this. Her descriptions of materials, that sounds like a really weird thing to comment on, but like materials of like furniture or clothes is so detailed. You can feel and taste and smell and see everything that she describes. The premise of this book is, again, it's a split narrative. One of the narratives is it's coming of age. We follow this young girl called Ivy Lin, who is a child of Chinese immigrants. She is going to this posh private school, which she gets into free because her father is the janitor. And so she mixes with all these children from very different parts of society to her, all of whom are white. She becomes kind of entranced by one of the boys who's at her school, and she sees him as like the epitome of like the American golden boy. And as a young person, she strives to lift herself above her family and to basically assimilate and to be like a white wealthy American. The other half of the narrative is her as an adult, as she is kind of further on her way to doing that. This book is very dark, twisty, nefarious. You question at all points whether you actually like Ivy, whether you want her to reach her goals. And yeah, this book goes some really dark places, and you read a lot of it towards the end with your heart in your throat. It's just really tense, and yeah, there are some really good kind of autumn winter scenes within this one, so highly recommend it for this time of year. So we have 3 books left, so we're on the home stretch. Firstly, we have October by Balin. I mean, come on, this is so autumnal. This is like the most autumnal cover of all time. This is a children or middle grade book that is about a young girl who has been raised by her father in the woods. They live this really remote life, and she doesn't really have any contact with the local community. She is homeschooled and they live off the land, and she loves this life. She's super close to nature. She rescues a baby owl that's fallen from the nest, and she just feels really happy in this life she has, and it's so wonderful and beautifully written and like super cozy to read those sections. But her father falls and breaks his leg, which means that she can't stay with him in the woods because he has to go and stay in a hospital. And so she has to go and move into a town with her mother and go to a normal school. And so this book is about how she deals with that, how she deals with seeing her mother again when she hasn't had much contact with her over the years, and how she deals mainly with being ripped away from this natural world she's come to love and having to get used to all the expectations of a more urban life, the noises and the lights and the expectations to communicate a lot with other people. And this book is just beautiful. As I said, the nature writing is lovely. It's so cozy. There's lots of discussions of like making a hot chocolate and like having a little cake. And I think I read this in one sitting last October, curled up on the sofa, which is the perfect way to read this. And then lastly, I have a couple of kind of cozy fantasy books. I think fantasy is great to read around this time of year, especially because they tend to be longer books, and I do like sort of sitting with some longer books this time of year. But I think in particular, cozy fantasy is really lovely for the autumnal months. Firstly, we have Mystic and Ryder by Sharon Shin. So I have read the first 3 or 4 books in this series, and I didn't enjoy any of them after this. I loved this, that I wouldn't recommend you carry on, which is a weird caveat. This works well as a standalone. So the premise of this is going to sound pretty straightforward and like run-of-the-mill, but it's more the way the book deals with this topic. This is about a woman who is classed as the mystic, and she is sent on a journey for the king with the king's rider, who is like the leader of the king's kind of army, I guess. And they are sent on this mission, this big old road trip on horseback, and they end up having a few other people with them. And kind of part of this mission is that it seems that people are targeting anyone who has any magical abilities, which our main character Seneth does. And so they're kind of investigating these acts of violence, which, yeah, in kind of this world is akin to targeting like witches or something. And yeah, so this book is basically that journey, that road trip. The characters are wonderful. I love getting to know all these characters. They sleep nearly every night outside in the wilds. The description of the woods and the noises from the woods and sitting by a campfire and finding their own food are just wonderful, like super, super cozy. There's also a really slow burn romance in this book that I loved. It was a joy to read about. Again, this is one I would happily reread. I sped through this one, but I just had so much fun. I loved these characters. I felt so much comfort. Like if I was going to look at my bookshelves and pick some books that I just felt really comforted by and the stakes weren't super high, this is definitely one of them. Like I just had a wonderful time reading it. So if you've ever wanted to try any kind of cozy fantasy, I would 100% recommend you start with this one. And then lastly, we have the first in a trilogy, and that is Dreamer's Pool by Juliet Marilia. This is the first book in the Blackthorn and Grimm trilogy, and I did enjoy all 3 books in this trilogy, so I would recommend you carry on. So Juliet Marilia is just a great author to read in the autumn because her books are so imbued with writing about magic and mystic and the fairy realm and the woods and living off the land. They are just beautiful. And the premise of this is that we are following this group of characters who are in a prison, 2 of which are Blackthorn, who is a witch, and Grimm, who is this kind of really strong, like silent type. And a fairy breaks them out of this prison. It's like a fairy king. And he says to them, to repay me for this, you need to go and live in this small community, and anytime you're asked to help, you need to assist. And so they go and start their life in this small community. In this book, a large part of the book is about them setting up a home, them planting their vegetable crop, Blackthorn finding where she can gather all the herbs and fungi she needs for her healing. And it's about them getting involved in this kind of mystery that they're asked to help in. Each book, that's the premise. They're asked to help with a mystery that has this kind of dark fairy element to it. The mystery is uncovered. There's always like a central romance between kind of side characters in the book, and then a larger part of the book is finding out more about Blackthorn and Grimm. They do have really sad backstories, and also finding out more about how their friendship builds between the 2 of them, which I really enjoyed watching. So yeah, I'd really recommend these books. There's a lot of kind of like woodland folk type magic scenes in this series, and I just think they're perfect to read this time of year. So those are all the books I wanted to recommend. I would love to know if you plan on picking any of them up this autumn. I'd also love to know your thoughts. If you've read any of these before, definitely let me know down below what you thought of them. And please feel free to recommend me some books for my autumn reading. I already have a list I'm working on that I'll probably upload in a couple of weeks. But yeah, I'm always interested to hear about more books that I can add to the list. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.